I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: has moral relativism destroyed Star Wars? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is because I've gone to the viewer mailbag and Andrew has sent me the following email. Hi Brendan, thanks for your videos on The Last Jedi. Keep them coming. Thanks, Andrew. One facet of The Last Jedi that I haven't seen you discuss yet is how the Jedi now no longer seem to be the good guys, or at best, they are neutral. However, this seems to be in direct contrast with George Lucas's fascinating views on Star Wars morality. My questions are these. Number one, do you think the introduction of moral relativism undermines the hero's journey narrative structure, therefore reducing entertainment value for audiences? And number two, what direction are Disney Lucasfilm hoping to see society take by introducing moral relativism? Well, first of all, let me say, in response to the second question, I don't know if necessarily they are trying to direct things in this particular regard. I think often art is a reflection more of the culture in which it is made. So it's just as likely that in actual fact, rather than having their own moral philosophy agenda, they are simply reflecting the sort of temperature of the culture of the day. They sort of stick their finger in the water, or they grow up in that particular culture, and so the art they create is contaminated by the culture they're in. Now, if the culture they're in is good, it's going to be contaminated by that or affected by that in a good way. If the culture they're in is a little bit morally confused, then the art is going to sort of reflect that as well. So I'm not sure if there is an agenda per se. The first and main question you've asked is moral relativism, destroying the hero's journey. What does it mean? Well, number one, I'm not sure if moral relativism actually is the problem here. I think that the bigger issue here is that sort of postmodern sort of cynicism about morality and about goodness. And it's really a reflection, I think, of the fact that a lot of baby boomers and a lot of Generation X's, they experienced a lot of what you might call institutional failure of institutions. So the boomers saw, their governments exposed. Like, think about Richard Nixon. Your government is exposed of actually engaging in criminal and corrupt practices. It's a big shock, that the institution of government could fail us. There's a lot of failure within religious institutions. There is a lot of economic and I guess social policies and things that sort of start to roll out, and particularly around the area of economics, and they start to have make their force. The impact of themselves really felt for the Generation X's. A lot of them were called the latchkey kids because they would come home and they would have to let themselves into the house because either mum or dad were both working in order to make ends meet, or mum and dad had split up. There was a lot of divorce in that group, and they really sort of bore the brunt of that. And so in that environment, it's not surprising that people start to develop cynicism about institutions, about hierarchies. They develop a very jaded view of these things, and I think that's what we see more of playing out in The Last Jedi, a sort of a cynicism about institutions, about hierarchy, about whether it's possible to be virtuous. There's this idea, or the sense you get when you look at Luke Skywalker, the idea that he would stand over his nephew and be willing to murder him in his sleep. It's almost as if what's being suggested to us here is, well, hey, all of us, given the right set of situations, we'd all contemplate doing the exact same thing, wouldn't we? It's that very cynical approach to morality and virtue and goodness, as if it's nothing more than a sort of a thin veneer, and if you strip away the veneer, then you discover that everyone is this evil sort of heart of darkness, and if they had the opportunity, they'd go around murdering everyone else. It's sort of very much this sort of Friedrich Nietzsche idea of the human person and what keeps us in control. But I would argue it's nonsense. Not every person is going to find themselves in a situation like that and go, oh yeah, I want to murder my nephew. A person who has been schooled in virtue and is well practiced in the virtues is not likely to actually to react that way in that situation. And interestingly, that's what Luke was. Luke was a character who was well schooled in virtue and had practiced the virtue in those previous films to a very high level. So it's very strange to us as an audience to all of a sudden see Luke Skywalker contemplating murdering his own nephew. That's why that moment was so unconvincing and so shocking and jarring for a lot of audiences, because it wasn't earned. It wasn't well crafted. The motivation just isn't there, because instinctively we know a person who is schooled and has practiced virtue doesn't suddenly become that unvirtuous that they're willing to murder someone. But if your mindset is that of a sort of postmodernist, sort of cynical person, and you sort of, the institutions fail, families fail, morality and virtue, it's all just a veneer, no one's really truly good, they're all just lying to us, they're pretending to be good, but you scratch the surface and they're all just evil, no one can be truly virtuous, then what Luke does there kind of makes sense. So I think that's actually more of an issue. Now, on the question of moral relativism, it's not actually Last Jedi that introduces moral relativism into the Star Wars universe. George Lucas did that right back at Return of the Jedi with some very clunky dialogue. Remember the scene where Luke goes to visit Yoda on Dagobah and Yoda dies, and then he comes out and Luke encounters Obi-Wan Kenobi, his Force ghost, and he says to Luke, "Why did you lie to me about my dad? You told me that Vader betrayed and killed my father. But obviously Vader is my dad, so that's a lie." And Obi-Wan replies and says, "Well, what I said is true from a certain point of view." And Luke goes, right, he says, certain point of view, because what he said was not true from any point of view. Vader did not betray Anakin. Vader is Anakin. And Anakin is not dead. He's very much alive. He's Vader. So objectively, what he said was completely false. And so George Lucas produces this clunky piece of dialogue, and then he follows it up with, after Luke goes from a certain point of view, he follows it up with Obi-Wan saying, "Well, you discover that a lot of the truths we cling to are, dependent on our own point of view." In other words, that's the introduction of moral relativism. Now, here's the thing. That moment didn't need to be as clunky and awful as it was. What actually should have happened there, and it's a very simple thing to do, is George Lucas should have simply had Obi-Wan Kenobi say this, and this was the obvious answer to that question: "Luke, I'm sorry, I failed you, but I thought I was protecting you. I thought, and I was afraid that this would swing you to the dark side, or it would destroy you in some way, and so I thought that I was protecting you by keeping the truth from you." That would be the sort of the more logical way to actually write that scene. But he doesn't. Instead, he introduces moral relativism. We also see Lucas again doing this with the prequels, with that statement, only Siths deal in absolutes. Really? So is it absolutely true that only Siths deal in absolutes? Because if it's absolutely true, then obviously you deal in absolutes as well. And more importantly, if you look at the Jedis and you see the Jedi Order, and particularly as they appear in the prequels, they clearly do deal in absolutes. They have these absolute moral norms which they are trying to uphold for the sake of peace in the galaxy. So it's a bit of an absurd statement. But the point is that Lucas already did that. And what Rian Johnson did was, as I said, I think he brought this sort of postmodern cynicism to the Jedis. And it doesn't even make any sense when you think about it. This is one of the failings here, is this whole idea that Luke has got, that the Jedi have failed and that they're part of the problem. What are you talking about? The Jedi protected peace and upheld order in the galaxy for what? Decades, years, hundreds, thousands of years. What do you mean that they're part of the problem? Just because people can be fallible, and therefore institutions that are made up of human beings can be fallible, it doesn't mean that all institutions or all hierarchies are bad or wrong, and that we should be cynical about these things. Just because you might have experienced a broken heart, or you might have experienced the pain of divorce, it doesn't mean that you should be then cynical about the possibility of anyone ever having a stable and good and flourishing marriage, or that you should ever think that relationships are impossible because clearly I should be cynical about this because of the brokenness I've experienced. So it seems to me that's more what and why the Jedi are being presented in this way. This whole let the past die, let's just kill it. I think also there's a bit of a not so subtle analogy for religion, the place of religion in society. And I don't think it's just bizarre. The whole thing is just this weird, cynical and lifeless thing to bring to a mythology, because it's just hopeless. It has no hope about it. It has no sense of meaning, of purpose. You can't live a motivated and fulfilled life by being cynical. You just can't. But in response to your question, would relativism destroy the hero's journey? Absolutely. Because if moral relativism is the way that we're going to now live our lives, which, by the way, even the most dedicated moral relativist does not want to live true moral relativism. Even the most dedicated moral relativist does not want to get into a car and get onto a freeway where everyone else gets to pick and decide whether or not it's morally right to drink and drive, or to drive at excessive speed. No one wants to live in that world where there are no actual moral codes that govern behaviour. So even the most dedicated moral relativist doesn't really want moral relativism as a way to to actually live their life. In the context of the Jedi and the Star Wars universe, if you think about moral relativism, what it would mean is that the hero's journey would become totally pointless. Because the worst that you could say about Palpatine and about the First Order and about the Empire and about Vader was that they just made different moral choices. And the best that you could say about Luke and the Jedi was they just made different moral choices from the dark side. But they're not any more good or true or right than what the dark side chose to do. Palpatine and Vader and the First Order, they're just being true to their own truths. That's their truth, and they're being faithful to their truth. But you can't say their truth is wrong because, all morality is just a social construct. It's just purely subjective. There's nothing that can be critiqued here as being wrong. It's just different. And there's nothing more sacred or good or true or beautiful about what the Jedi do. So effectively, there is no hero's journey. There can be no virtue in a society where you don't believe that virtue is anything more than a social construct. And so without virtue, the hero's journey becomes impossible, or effectively what you might do at best is reduce the hero's journey to little more than, did he maximize our evolutionary advantage by doing what he did? Well, we should celebrate that. Or did he maximize the total amount of pleasure over pain that can be experienced by the galaxy? Well, let's give him a round of applause for that. But that's it. It's reduced to this sort of blind matter and motion, this philosophical materialism. The whole concept of virtue gets stripped out of it. The whole concept of the hero's journey, not only does it become pointless, it actually becomes quite evil when you think about it, because why the heck should Luke actually be willing to sacrifice himself like he is in Return of the Jedi for what is good and true and beautiful, if what is good, true and beautiful is nothing more than a social construct, and it's not any more good, true and beautiful than what the dark side are doing? It actually makes absolutely no sense. It's insane. Luke should actually probably join the dark side and say, well, if neither of us is actually right, I might as well go this way because you've got the power. Maybe I can at least do some good along the way if I get a bit of that power for myself. But again, what good can he do along the way if good is not a thing that actually exists? So yeah, moral relativism absolutely does destroy the hero's journey. But I think in this case with The Last Jedi, what you're seeing is more of a sort of cynicism. And moral relativism is sort of wrapped up in it, but I think it's more that cynical take on hierarchies and institutions and virtue and goodness. This idea that just because we can't be perfectly virtuous all the time, that sort of there's no point in trying to be virtuous at all, that virtue is impossible. That you can never achieve any moment of perfection and virtue. Well, you can. You can achieve moments of perfection and virtue. You just can't be perfect all the time. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't keep striving to be good and virtuous. That you shouldn't keep striving towards that perfection, even if you can't achieve it, because when you strive towards it, you flourish as a human person. And when a society strives towards it, the society begins to flourish. So the cynicism doesn't really help anyone, and I think that's more of a reflection, though, of what we're actually seeing in The Last Jedi. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. There's a link for both in the video description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.